What if the safest home wasn't above ground, but inside it? One couple made a choice everyone laughed at, and winter put it to the test. Like the video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The land outside Rockford Creek, Wyoming, was the kind of place people only bought when they had no better options left. The wind never truly stopped there. It slid down from the open plains, gathered speed across the bare hills, and slammed into anything that dared to stand upright for too long. Fence posts leaned, old barns groaned. Even the ground seemed restless, stripped of trees and softened features by decades of weather that showed no mercy and asked for no permission. Nathan Brooks stood on that land one late afternoon, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket, watching the grass ripple like water under the constant push of the wind. He could hear it clearly, the low, steady roar that never faded into silence. Most people heard that sound and felt unwelcome. Nathan heard it and felt challenged. Emily stood a few steps behind him, holding the paperwork they had just signed in town. The ink was barely dry. The land was officially theirs now, bought for a price so low it had raised eyebrows at the county office. No one wanted it. That fact alone had followed them all the way back from Rockford Creek, echoing in the sideways looks and half-spoken warnings they had received. People in Rockford Creek talked freely. It was a small place, the kind where conversations drifted through open doors and lingered long after the speakers had moved on. At the general store that morning, the clerk had glanced at the address on the forms and paused just long enough to make his opinion clear. "That stretch?" he'd asked. "Nothing holds up out there." At the fuel pump, a man leaning against his truck had laughed when Nathan mentioned building a home. "You can try," he'd said, "but the wind will tear it apart before the first winter's over." Nathan hadn't argued. He rarely did. He had listened, nodded, and carried the words with him like weights he intended to measure later. They had come to Wyoming because they wanted space, not just physical distance from crowded towns and narrow streets, but room to breathe, to build something that belonged entirely to them. They didn't have much money. What they had instead was time, stubbornness, and a shared belief that survival didn't always mean following the same paths everyone else had already worn smooth. The first idea had been simple enough: a small house, solid wood, nothing fancy. Nathan had sketched it out weeks before they arrived, imagining walls thick enough to block the wind and a roof pitched low to resist the storms. But standing there now, with the wind pressing against his chest and tugging at his clothes, the idea already felt fragile. Emily stepped up beside him. Her hair whipped across her face, and she laughed quietly as she tried to brush it away, giving up when the wind immediately pulled it loose again. "It doesn't feel angry," she said after a moment. "Just relentless." Nathan nodded. "That's worse." They spent the next few days walking the land, not just across it, but into it. Nathan paid attention to the slope of the hills, the way water cut narrow channels after rare rains, the spots where the ground felt firmer underfoot. Emily watched the light, noting how the sun moved, how long it lingered on the southern faces of the hills before disappearing behind the western rise. On the third day, as the wind howled harder than usual, Nathan climbed partway up a low hill at the edge of their property. Near the base, where the slope thickened and the ground turned darker and more compact, he stopped. The wind dropped suddenly, not completely, but enough to be noticeable. The noise softened. The pressure eased. He crouched and pressed his palm against the earth. It was cool, but not cold. Steady. Emily noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked, stepping closer. "It's quieter," he said. "Down here." They didn't say anything else for a long moment. They didn't need to. The idea didn't arrive all at once, not as a clear plan, but as a realization that settled slowly between them. The land itself was offering something different. Not a surface to build on, but a place to step into. That evening, back in town, the conversations followed them again. Word traveled fast in Rockford Creek. Someone mentioned that the Brooks couple had been seen measuring the hillside instead of laying out a foundation. "They're digging now?" a woman asked, half amused. "Guess they're trying to hide from the wind," someone else replied. The nickname came quickly after that. Not cruel, but dismissive, said with a smirk, "The moles." Nathan heard it once, then again. He let it pass without comment. Emily only smiled. "They think we're ridiculous," she said quietly as they walked back to their truck under a sky already filling with low, fast-moving clouds. "Maybe," Nathan replied, "or maybe they just can't see it yet." That night, the wind battered the temporary shelter they had set up near the road. The canvas snapped and strained against its ties, and sleep came in short, broken pieces. At some point before dawn, Nathan woke and lay still, listening. Beneath the noise, beneath the surface chaos, he could feel the calm waiting below ground. The certainty of it settled into him, heavy and reassuring. By morning, the decision no longer felt like a risk. It felt like an answer. They stood together at the base of the hill as the sun climbed, warming only the exposed surfaces before the wind stole the heat away again. Nathan picked up a shovel and pressed it into the soil. The ground resisted at first, then gave way with a dull, solid sound that felt promising rather than discouraging. Emily watched him, then picked up another tool and joined him without a word. Behind them, Rockford Creek went on as it always had, full of doubt and familiar methods. Ahead of them, the hill waited, silent and unmoved by opinion. They didn't know yet how deep they would have to go, or how much work it would take. They only knew that standing exposed against the wind would never be enough. If they were going to build a home here, it wouldn't rise above the land, it would disappear into it. By the time the first real hole took shape in the hillside, the laughter in Rockford Creek had sharpened into certainty. People drove past slowly now, pretending not to stare while clearly doing exactly that. A few stopped outright, leaning on their truck doors as if curiosity alone justified the pause. Nathan worked methodically. Every cut into the earth followed the slope he had studied for days, careful not to fight the land but to slip into it. The soil near the surface was loose and pale, easily removed, but deeper layers darkened and compacted, holding together with a stubborn strength that resisted careless digging. It was exhausting work. Shovel, lift, step, dump. Over and over, until his shoulders burned and his hands numbed despite the gloves. Emily measured and marked while he dug. She used stakes and string to outline a broad rectangle facing south, wide enough for windows, narrow enough to keep the structure stable. The entrance would be the only part fully exposed. Everything else would sink backward into the hill, wrapped in earth on three sides. They argued quietly at night, not out of anger, but fear. What if the walls collapsed? What if moisture crept in and never left? What if the air turned stale, heavy, dangerous? Nathan answered with planning. He widened the excavation slowly, sloping the ceiling inward, shaping the space so pressure would push down instead of inward. He carved shallow channels into the floor to guide water away before it ever became a problem. Each evening, he sat with a notebook, sketching airflow paths, calculating where vents would rise and how they would draw fresh air down naturally. Emily focused on light. She stood at the entrance at different hours, watching how the sun shifted across the opening. She noted where shadows fell, where reflected light lingered longest. Using scavenged boards and sheets of metal, she began experimenting with angled surfaces that bounced sunlight deeper inside. The space brightened incrementally, no longer a dark cavity, but something closer to a room waiting to be finished. The first frame went up after 2 weeks. Thick wooden posts anchored into the packed earth, set back from the outer wall so the soil itself became part of the structure. Nathan worked carefully, checking each beam twice, sometimes 3 times. If this failed, it wouldn't be just embarrassing, it would be dangerous. That was when the warnings grew louder. "You're digging your own grave," someone shouted one afternoon from the road. Another voice followed. "Spring melt will drown you in there." Nathan kept working. He knew the land sloped naturally away from the hill. He had watched water move across it after a rare rain, seen how it avoided this spot instinctively. He trusted observation more than opinion. Inside, the temperature already felt different. Even unfinished, even open to the air, the space resisted extremes. The midday heat faded quickly once inside. At night, the cold crept in more slowly, lingering at the entrance while the deeper walls stayed steady. Emily noticed it first. "It doesn't swing," she said, pressing her palm against the packed earth. "It stays." They built the roof low, just high enough to stand comfortably. Thick beams ran front to back, layered with boards, then sealed beneath a dense covering of soil. The hill reclaimed its shape almost immediately, swallowing the structure until only the front wall remained visible. Ventilation became Nathan's obsession. He cut 2 narrow shafts upward at the rear corners, lining them carefully and capping them to block wind while still allowing air to move. When the breeze passed over the hilltop, it pulled air through the space below, slow and constant. They tested it with smoke from a small fire pan, watching the thin trails drift upward and vanish. The nickname followed them everywhere now, the Moles. People said it with a laugh, but also with relief. As long as someone else was doing something stranger, their own doubts felt smaller. The first night they slept inside the unfinished home, the wind screamed louder than ever. It battered the exposed entrance, howled across the hill, shook loose objects outside. Inside, the sound dulled into a distant presence, like surf heard from far away. Emily lay awake, listening. "It's not silent," she whispered. "No," Nathan replied, "but it's controlled." That mattered more than silence ever could. They sealed the entrance wall last, setting thick windows into reinforced frames. The glass was simple, salvaged, but placed with precision. Southern light poured in during the morning hours, warming the floor and the front wall. Emily arranged reflective panels along the interior to spread that warmth deeper inside. By the time the first frost silvered the grass outside, the house was no longer an experiment. It was a space with rooms, with purpose. Storage carved into the back wall. Sleeping area tucked away from the entrance. A central living space where warmth collected naturally. Still, doubt lingered. In quiet moments, Nathan stood alone, listening to the earth press close around them. He wondered if they had miscalculated, if confidence had replaced caution too easily. Emily sensed it. She always did. "We're not pretending this will be easy," she said one evening as they sat near the entrance, watching the last light fade. "We're just choosing a different kind of hard." Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant boards slamming, of structures straining against forces they were never meant to resist. Inside, the walls held. Winter had not yet arrived, but it was coming. And when it did, this strange, half-hidden home would face its first true test. Winter announced itself early that year, not with a single storm, but with a steady tightening of the world. The wind sharpened, the sky flattened into dull sheets of gray, and the nights stretched longer than Nathan remembered from any season before. Frost crept across the land in thin white layers, then returned thicker each morning, until the grass no longer rose beneath it. In Rockford Creek, people prepared the way they always had. Extra boards went over windows. Chimneys were checked and rechecked. Firewood piles grew taller, stacked with nervous precision. Everyone knew winter here was never gentle, but this one carried a weight that felt different, heavier, more insistent. The first major storm arrived in late November. Wind tore across the open ground without pause, slamming into buildings and rattling doors until sleep became impossible. Snow followed, driven sideways, piling unevenly against walls and fences. By morning, one barn roof had partially collapsed, and 2 chimneys had cracked under the strain of cold and pressure. Inside the hillside, Nathan and Emily felt the storm only as a distant force. The sound reached them softened, filtered through layers of packed earth. The temperature inside the house barely shifted. The walls held a steady, cool warmth, not hot, not cold, but stable in a way that felt almost unnatural compared to the chaos outside. Nathan watched the thermometer he had hung near the center of the room. It dropped slowly, a single degree over hours, then stopped. He adjusted nothing. He waited. Emily focused on the front room, where sunlight still reached through the southern windows during clear moments. She had set shallow boxes there, filled with soil hauled in and sifted carefully. In them, she planted hardy greens, chosen for resilience rather than abundance. Lettuce, spinach, small herbs, nothing ambitious, just proof. The night the temperature outside plunged well below zero, the wind grew violent enough to shake loose items even inside their sheltered entrance. Snow pressed hard against the front wall, but the slope of the hill deflected most of it upward and away. The vents continued to breathe steadily, drawing fresh air without letting the cold rush in. Emily woke before dawn and padded quietly across the floor. She checked the plants first. The soil was cool but unfrozen. The leaves curled slightly at the edges, stressed but alive. "It held," she whispered when Nathan joined her. Outside, it did not. By midday, news traveled through Rockford Creek of damage and loss. One family burned through nearly half their winter wood in a single week. Another discovered ice forming inside their walls. The wind found every weakness and widened it. Late that afternoon, someone appeared at the entrance. Nathan heard footsteps crunching unevenly through snow and stepped forward, cautious. When he opened the door, a blast of cold air rushed in, sharp enough to sting his lungs. A man stood there, shoulders hunched, face red from exposure. It was Harold Miller. "My roof didn't make it through the night," Harold said, his voice tight. "I just need a place to warm up, just for a bit." Nathan stepped aside without hesitation. The change hit Harold immediately. He stopped just inside the door, blinking, breathing hard, disbelief written plainly across his face. "It's warm," he said, quieter now. "Not just warmer, warm." Emily brought him water and guided him to sit. Harold stayed longer than he intended, then longer still. By evening, he admitted the truth. His house wasn't safe, not tonight. Maybe not for days. They made space. More storms followed, each stacking on the last. Snow accumulated faster than anyone could clear it. The wind never paused long enough to give relief. On the third storm, another knock came, then another. People arrived with numb hands and hollow eyes, carrying children wrapped in blankets, bringing only what they could hold. The house adapted. Nathan organized sleeping areas carefully, keeping weight balanced, airflow unobstructed. He monitored the vents constantly, adjusting them only when necessary. Emily managed food and warmth, rationing without fear but without waste. The plants by the windows continued to grow slowly, stubbornly green against the white world outside. Living together was not easy. Space was limited. Tempers flared quietly, then cooled. The constant pressure of winter tested everyone, but the earth around them did not move, did not creak or complain. It simply held. One night, as the wind reached a pitch that sounded almost alive, a loud crack echoed faintly through the distance. Someone outside lost another roof. Inside the hillside, no one stirred. The sound faded, absorbed by the layers of soil and stone. Emily sat near the plants, trimming a leaf carefully. "They're still growing," she said softly. "Slow, but steady." Nathan looked around the room, at the people sleeping, the walls enclosing them, the stability that had once seemed impossible. "Then so are we," he replied. Winter had arrived in full force. The experiment was no longer theoretical. It was survival, unfolding day by day, sheltered not by defiance but by understanding. By midwinter, the house in the hill was no longer just Nathan and Emily's refuge. It had become something else entirely, though no one ever named it. It simply was where people went when the cold took more than it gave back. The laughter that once followed the word moles had disappeared, replaced by quiet voices and careful movements inside walls that demanded respect. The first rule Nathan established was simple. Order mattered. Space was divided with intention, not ownership. Each family was given a defined area, small but clear, so no one felt displaced or forgotten. Sleeping arrangements were rotated to keep weight and warmth distributed evenly. The entrance area remained open, free of clutter, so air could move without obstruction. Emily handled food and routine. She understood instinctively that survival in close quarters depended on structure as much as shelter. Mornings began the same way every day. Fires were checked, water warmed, meals planned. People were given tasks, not as orders, but as contributions. Cooking, cleaning, watching the vents, helping with the plants. The change in the visitors was gradual but unmistakable. At first, they spoke little, exhaustion and disbelief weighing on them. They expected the warmth to fade, the air to turn stale, the walls to betray them. When that didn't happen, curiosity replaced fear. "How does it stay so steady?" someone asked one evening, running a hand along the packed earth wall. Nathan explained patiently. He talked about mass and insulation, about how the earth resisted sudden change. He showed them the vents, the angles, the way airflow followed pressure instead of fighting it. He didn't frame it as brilliance, he framed it as listening. Emily did the same with light and heat. She showed the women how the reflective panels worked, how the sun's energy could be captured and reused rather than wasted. She taught them how to protect the plants on the coldest nights, how to read subtle changes in leaf color and soil texture. Disagreements happened. They were inevitable. Space was tight. The winter was relentless. Once, raised voices echoed through the room, sharp and jarring in the enclosed space. Nathan didn't shout back. He waited. When the noise settled, he gathered everyone together. "This place only works if we do," he said. "Not because it's forgiving, but because it's balanced. We push it too far, it pushes back." They listened. As days turned into weeks, routine settled into something almost peaceful. The outside world shrank to a rumor carried in by wind and snow. Inside, time moved differently. Children adapted fastest, treating the space as an adventure rather than confinement. They learned where not to step, when to stay quiet, how to help without being asked. The plants became a shared responsibility. Each family tended a section, learning patience as growth slowed under limited light. The small harvests were celebrated not for their size, but for what they represented. Fresh food in the heart of winter, proof that the system held. One evening, during a rare lull in the storm, Harold Miller stood near the entrance, staring out at the frozen landscape. His face looked older than it had when he arrived, but steadier. "I used to think strength meant standing up to this place," he said. "Building higher, thicker, stronger." Nathan joined him, keeping his voice low. "And now?" "And now I think it means knowing when to step aside." Others came to similar conclusions on their own. They studied the walls, the ceiling, the way the house felt less like a structure and more like part of the land itself. The hill wasn't holding them hostage, it was holding them together. As January dragged on, the storms lost their shock but not their force. Snow piled deeper than anyone could remember. Temperatures dropped low enough that even the air seemed brittle. Outside, animals vanished. Inside, the house endured. By the time the light began to linger just a little longer each afternoon, the people who had once mocked the idea of disappearing into the ground spoke of it differently. Not as hiding, but as adapting. Not as weakness, but as understanding. The house had changed them. Not by comfort alone, but by forcing cooperation, patience, and humility. They no longer spoke of surviving the winter as individuals. They spoke of getting through it together. When the wind finally softened for the first time in months, no one cheered. They simply noticed the quiet, aware now of how fragile even that could be. The hill remained unchanged, solid as it had always been. And with it, the idea that had once seemed foolish had taken root, spreading quietly through minds that had learned the cost of resisting a land that demanded respect. Spring did not arrive all at once. It edged in carefully, testing the land the way a cautious traveler tests ice. The storms weakened first, their violence replaced by longer pauses between bursts of wind. Snow still covered the ground, but it began to settle instead of pile, sinking slowly into itself as daylight stretched farther into the evenings. Inside the hillside, the change was felt before it was seen. The air grew softer, moisture shifted, the vents carried a different scent, faint but unmistakable, the smell of thawing earth. Nathan noticed the thermometer rise by a degree, then another, not sharply but steadily, like a held breath finally released. People began to leave in small groups, timing their departures between weather systems. They returned to damaged homes with tired bodies and changed minds. Roofs needed rebuilding, chimneys needed reinforcement. But more than repairs, they carried something less visible with them, a new understanding of what shelter could mean. They did not leave empty-handed. Emily divided seeds from the cave plants carefully, explaining which had tolerated cold best, which needed the least light, which roots held moisture longest. She wrote notes in neat, deliberate handwriting, instructions meant to be remembered, not admired. Nathan sketched diagrams in the dirt outside the entrance, showing how depth mattered more than thickness, how slope could redirect pressure, how ventilation worked best when it followed natural flow instead of force. At first, only a few listened closely. Then more gathered. Questions grew specific, thoughtful, less about whether it could work and more about how. By the time the last family returned to Rockford Creek, the word moles was no longer spoken with humor. It wasn't spoken much at all. As the ground softened, Nathan and Emily walked the land again, this time without urgency. They examined the hillside, the entrance now free of snow, the structure settled and unmoving beneath the surface. Nothing had shifted. Nothing had cracked. The earth had accepted what they placed within it. Others began to follow their example, not copies, but variations. A partial earth shelter near a creek, a low structure carved into a south-facing slope. Homes that didn't fight the wind but stepped beneath it. Rockford Creek changed quietly, without announcements or pride. People simply built differently. Nathan was asked to help more often than he expected. At first, he resisted. He was not interested in being a leader, but he understood systems, and systems only worked when knowledge moved freely. He walked properties, pointed out natural advantages, warned against careless shortcuts. He refused payment most of the time, accepting labor instead when he couldn't refuse at all. Emily's role grew just as naturally. She taught people how to extend growing seasons, how to use reflected light, how to protect soil instead of exhausting it. What began as necessity turned into trade. Fresh greens sold early in the season, seeds exchanged, knowledge shared. The hillside home became a reference point, not a monument, but an example. When visitors arrived from farther out, they were surprised by how unremarkable it looked from the outside. Just a quiet opening in the land, almost modest. Inside, it felt different, calm, purposeful. One evening, as the last patches of snow retreated into shadow, Nathan and Emily sat near the entrance, watching the wind move across the open hills. It was still there, constant as ever, but it no longer felt personal. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd built above ground?" Emily asked. Nathan considered it. He thought of broken boards, of sleepless nights, of burning through resources faster than they could be replaced. "We would have survived," he said finally, "for a while, and then we would have lost." She nodded. "I'm glad we didn't choose that version." So was he. The next winter came and went without drama. Storms still arrived, but they no longer carried panic with them. People prepared differently now. Some went deeper. Some angled walls more carefully. Some simply accepted that the land was not an enemy to defeat, but a force to understand. Standing at the entrance one evening as the first snow of the season drifted down, Nathan felt something settle inside him. Not pride, not relief. Something quieter. Satisfaction. They had not conquered the land. They had learned from it. Behind him, the house held steady. The walls absorbed warmth. The air moved gently. Life continued without strain. The wind passed overhead, loud but harmless, unaware that it no longer ruled this place. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Nathan understood what home truly meant. Not a structure raised in defiance, but one shaped by listening. Not a fortress, but a partnership. The earth had always been there, waiting. They had simply chosen to step inside it. This story wasn't about hiding, it was about understanding nature. If it resonated, like the video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from.